What's happening, everybody? It's good to see you today on the Speak and See Show. Like, subscribe, and click that notification button so when I get information out, you can get information in. So the piece that I just put out on Tucker Carlson and Jeffrey Sachs the other day has gained international attention of Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who spoke on it during the embassy roundtable on resolving the crisis around Ukraine and the world. Yeah, Russia is listening to Tucker Carlson. First of all, that's kind of funny, but hardly believable, but it's true. And if you think it's hard to believe that our Russian foreign ministers and politicians actually watch the Tucker Carlson show, if you think that's hard to believe, what's even hard to believe is what is on the show.
Just yesterday, the famous American economist and political scientist Jeffrey Sachs giving an interview to Tucker Carlson.
But once in a while, you'll actually find the truth expressed in such a vulgar way. No, they don't count the Ukrainian lives. They literally say no American lives. We're not even so sure about that, by the way, but
no, Americans have died.
Yeah, it's not a large number, but it's some, but they don't tell us the truth about that either.
Again recalled what he is convinced is a historical mistake. History has no subjunctive mood. Well, now we can say with confidence that the reason for this decision was the ineradicable desire of the United States to maintain NATO as a tool of control over Europe, at the head of the collective West, to under no circumstances lose its hegemony in the international arena. This becomes increasingly difficult, if not impossible.
We're talking about a counterpart that has 6,000 nuclear warheads. We have 6,000 nuclear warheads. We have a lot of crazy people in our government. I know it. I'm adult enough to know over 44 years of professional life that there are a lot of intemperate people in our country. Honestly, a president of a Baltic state tweeting that Russia must be destroyed. This is prudent. This is safe. This is going to keep your family and my family safe. Are we out of our minds?
Давайте разобьем на ряд очевидных вопросов. Псков — это же рядом граница НАТО. Откуда был запуск? С Украины, что ли? Ага, сейчас. С территории Прибалтики? Уничтожить нахрен Прибалтику, если так. Стереть с лица земли.
And all through this, Biden hasn't called Putin one time. And I speak to very senior Russian officials. You speak to the most senior Russian official. They say, we want to negotiate. Of course, we'll talk.
As powerful economic giants rise, primarily on the Eurasian continent, but also in Africa and Latin America, and this struggle for hegemony, for maintaining hegemony using sanctions, blackmail, threats, armed force, is a struggle for the passing era. We have already discussed this topic. When necessary, they organize a coup d'etat, and they declare that democracy has prevailed in some country.
They weren't the ones to put the bullet through the head of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, but they tried, and they supported the overthrow of Lumumba, and of course they were trying to kill Castro and many other things. So they found unbelievable things. Now that was 1975. Since then, we're 49 years. There's never been another church committee of its kind. It's unbelievable how many things have happened since then. The list, believe me, is very, very long. I've seen some of it so directly, I can't, it's just shocking to me, but just an insight into how our country works, which you know very well, but to me, I find it so weird.
We see how the West wants to extend its influence to Central Asia. Therefore, the task of isolating Russia and preventing it from developing, preventing it from fully realizing its potential, of course, is illusory and utopian. But the quality of current politicians in the West allows us to assume that they can seriously make illusions and utopias their practical program.
To me, I find it so weird.
And when somewhere, for example, in Africa, revolutionary forces come to power and want to get rid of the last shackles of neocolonialism, then they call this a violation of the Constitution. Then they impose sanctions, and much more. This is what President Putin did at the Munich conference in 2007, when he openly and naturally politely drew the attention of the Western leaders present there to the fact that they will not be able to dictate their will to everyone, and that the world is much more diverse than Western civilization.
It was even harder to swallow the truth that was coming out of Jeffrey Sachs about America's dealings in overthrowing countries that came out during that interview.
George, don't do this. Don't do this. This is extraordinarily dangerous. This is really provocative. We don't really need or want NATO right up to the Russian border. Putin was there the next day in Bucharest saying, don't do this. This is completely reckless. Essentially, this is our fundamental red line. Do not do this. The U.S. can't hear any of this. This is our biggest problem. And indeed, at the end of 2013, the U.S. absolutely stokes a crisis that becomes an insurrection and then becomes a coup. And so the U.S. conspired with a Ukrainian right to overthrow Yanukovych, and there was a violent overthrow in the third week of February of 2014. That's when this war started. This war didn't even start in 2022. It started in 2014. That was the outbreak of the war, was a violent coup that overthrew a Ukrainian president that wanted neutrality.
It was hard to believe. But this snowball that we're seeing is getting larger than life for those who think you're in the know out there. You might just throw half the information that you know away. Throw it away. You'll be throwing it away after this interview. So yeah, it's a good interview.
When he was violently overthrown and his security people told him, you're going to get killed. And so he flew to Kharkiv and then flew onward to Russia that day. The U.S. immediately, in a nanosecond, recognized the new government. Oh, this is a coup. This is how the CIA does its regime change operations. So this is when the war starts. Putin's understanding, completely correct in this moment, was, I'm not letting NATO take my naval fleet and my naval base in Crimea. Are you kidding?
Now, Jeffrey Sachs exposed the coups past and presently led by the United States. In fact, he gave shattering details of both historical and present actions in their efforts, the United States government's efforts of a unipolar world order, one world order.
But in any event, the war starts then, and within a year, the Russians are saying, very wisely, we actually don't want this war. We don't want to own Ukraine. We don't want problems on our border. We would like peace based on respect for the ethnic Russians in the East and political autonomy, because you, the coup government, tried to close down all Russian language, culture, and rights of these people after having made a violent coup. So we don't accept that. So what came out of that was two agreements called the Minsk I and the Minsk II agreement. The Minsk II agreement was backed by the UN Security Council.
And we see in this struggle that the West is grasping at all its illegitimate methods. In general, the agony of the world order that the United States is still imposing on everyone else begins. This is not international law, based on the UN Charter in its entirety and in all the interconnectedness of its principles, but rather a rules-based order. We have already discussed this topic. When necessary, they organize a coup d'etat, and they declare that democracy has prevailed in some country.
The police force of the earth. Yes, it totally exists. If you didn't watch that video with Jeffrey Sachs, I'll put it in the link below, and I'll put it towards the end. You can link onto it at the end of this video. And I suggest you watch it because it's jaw-dropping, flabbergasting, eye-opening, but most of all concerning. And just hearing the Russian foreign minister saying, in this clip, you're going to see, the Russian foreign minister says, as everyone saw on the Tucker Carlson show. Now, that was kind of unanticipated to hear him say that. But in the same moment, it was like ear candy to hear that he concurred with what Tucker Carlson and Jeffrey Sachs had said, and they've got receipts on it. The depths and components, not only maybes or ifs or of how it could be done, but the proportionate specifics on where it's being done, and when it's being done, who's being assassinated, which country the U.S. took over by using coup d'etats on Africa, Ukraine, Syria, Congo, the list goes on and on and on. And now, We find out we're dealing with a government that is a loose cannon with a bunch of people living in the United States government, living in an illusionary utopia, as he describes it. They're playing games with the majority of people's lives around the world. Yes, the world is affected negatively by these issues, and it's part of a master plan. What say you? Well, hopefully you say something in the comment section below. I ask that you please support this channel with a like, and we'd love to have you subscribe as well, as we're all here to share, encourage, and love one another. And we do that with communication here and family, that we become one love. Now, if you've seen the momentous video with Tucker Carlson and Jeffrey Sachs that was influential and detailed enough to gain the world's attention, here's Sergei Lavrov's message to the world in response to it. And let me tell you what, he didn't hold back either. Facts, baby. These are facts. So grab a drink and let's be informed as well as being educated. But before I start, let me just say that if you didn't see the last video, once again, that we put out, please go and watch that after this, and I'll leave a link at the end of the video. Let's check it out.
You know, the roots of this crisis go far back into modern history, in the period that preceded the collapse of the Soviet Union, but also in subsequent years. Today, many historians, responsible political scientists, experts, primarily in the West, are saying what their colleagues have been saying for many years, maybe even decades. Namely, when the Warsaw Pact was disbanded, when the Soviet Union opened up to unite with Europe, with the United States, with the West as a whole, on the basis of equality, on the basis of mutual benefit, mutual respect, no one began to disband NATO. And, by and large, no one was going to do this. Many consider this a mistake. Just yesterday, the famous American economist and political scientist Jeffrey Sachs, giving an interview to Tucker Carlson, again recalled what he is convinced is a historical mistake. History has no subjunctive mood. NATO exists. Moreover, there are apparently reasons why NATO did not reciprocate the Warsaw Pact. It didn't disband on its own. It did not propose that the former countries of the socialist camp leave only the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, not have any closed military blocs, and from now on live in a new way, openly, on the basis of mutual respect, in search of mutual benefit. This was not done. Well, now we can say with confidence that the reason for this decision was the ineradicable desire of the United States to maintain NATO as a tool of control over Europe, including over Germany, where dozens of American military bases are still located, so that the Germans obey orders from Washington. So that when, in order to eliminate a competitor in the European energy market, the United States would blow up main pipelines called Nord Streams, to keep the Germans silent, so that they swallow it in silence, and so that they are willing to pay 1.5 to 2 times more for American liquefied natural gas than they previously paid for Russian gas supplies via pipeline, in order to keep Europe in a subordinate position to the United States. NATO was needed. That is why, at the moment when the Warsaw Pact was disbanded, no one began to disband NATO, and, on the contrary, they began to use it to strengthen American hegemony on this continent, and now on other continents. Have you heard what Stoltenberg said recently when they asked him that NATO is a defensive alliance, that it defends the territory of its member countries, and that it does nothing else? He said yes, it's true, but the threat to the territories of member countries allegedly comes from different parts of the world, including from the Indo-Pacific region, so NATO will spread its infrastructure. It will create alliances in this region, in the Asia-Pacific region, which they call the Indo-Pacific region, for obvious reasons. And in this sense, the security of the Euro-Atlantic and the security of the Asia-Pacific region are inseparable, Stoltenberg said. So, many countries of our common continent should prepare for the fact that NATO will try to ensure our security. But, returning to the period of the collapse of the Soviet Union, in addition to the fact that agreements were reached in the field of arms control, which many of our experts consider not entirely fair and containing unilateral concessions on the part of the Soviet Union, in addition to subsequent arms control agreements that ensured a permanent presence of American observers right at the gates of the facilities where our strategic nuclear weapons were produced. Besides the fact that in the early 1990s, a huge number of American and other Western experts worked in most government agencies of our country, the new Russian Federation, against the backdrop of all this. Or maybe that's why the Soviet Union disappeared, which was the most important rival and competitor of the United States and its world order. It was a country that, at the head of the socialist camp, in collaboration with the countries of Asia, Africa and Latin America, promoted the principles of respect for the UN Charter, And this country disappeared. And you remember how the American economist, political scientist Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history. He said that from now on and forever the liberal world order will dominate, that they do not expect any opposition from anyone. But this only meant that they decided that the new Russia, as well as all the former republics of the Soviet Union, as well as all the former members of the Warsaw Pact, that they were now all in the pocket of the United States and the collective West. This was the obvious opinion that prevailed there, and which dominated there for a very long time. But even now they are still driven by this idea. All the events that we are witnessing now stem from the desire of the United States, at the head of the collective West, to under no circumstances lose its hegemony in the international arena. This becomes increasingly difficult, if not impossible, as powerful economic giants rise, primarily on the Eurasian continent, but also in Africa and Latin America. And this struggle for hegemony, for maintaining hegemony using sanctions, blackmail, threats, armed force, is a struggle for the passing era. It is clear, and we see in this struggle, that the West is grasping at all its illegitimate methods. In general, the agony of the world order that the United States is still imposing on everyone else begins. This is not international law, based on the UN Charter in its entirety and in all the interconnectedness of its principles, but rather a rules-based order. We have already discussed this topic. When necessary, they organize a coup d'etat, and they declare that democracy has prevailed in some country. And when somewhere, for example, in Africa, revolutionary forces come to power and want to get rid of the last shackles of neocolonialism, then they call this a violation of the Constitution. Then they impose sanctions, and much more. Returning to the beginning of those events that have now determined what is happening in Europe, but also in the world as a whole. So, the West decided that Russia is in its pocket. Therefore, when in 2000, after the first election of Vladimir Putin as president of Russia, Russia began to regain its dignity, its right to its rightful place, which rightfully should have belonged to it in the international arena, the United States at first did not take it seriously. Well, they thought that these were some individual manifestations of our national character. Moreover, at that time, in the 2000s, Russia, advocating respect for its rights, defended these rights in the international arena exclusively through offers of cooperation and equal agreements. And there are many examples of this. We have created an extensive system of interaction with the European Union. There were dozens of mechanisms, formats, structures, that met many times throughout each year, developed road maps, and agreed on the creation of 4 common spaces on the entire Eurasian continent. There were a lot of creative, progressive and promising ideas there. Regarding the same NATO, despite the West's violation of its promise and commitment, given to the Soviet leadership, then given to the first leaders of the Russian Federation, not to expand NATO to the east. As you know, this expansion still took place. But even then, even at the end of the 1990s, Russian Foreign Minister Yevgeny Primakov, during negotiations with the North Atlantic Alliance, still showed a willingness not to put up a pose, not to begin aggressive counteraction to a violation that occurred contrary to the word of honor of our Western partners. But he became look for compromises. As a compromise, it was agreed, and the West assumed these obligations, that significant combat forces would not be stationed on the territory of the new NATO members. That is, we accepted the fact that they have new NATO members. All this was consolidated within the framework of the Russian NATO Council, which also worked in many areas. Groups were created to combat terrorism, to assist Afghanistan, and much more. Now all this has been destroyed by the West due to its unilateral decision. But they allegedly made a compromise, that permanent significant combat forces would not be stationed on the territory of the new NATO members. After that, we began to notice that there was such a placement. The West began to tell us that these are not significant and not permanent forces. They say they have 1 brigade heading there, and this is on a rotational basis. Then this brigade leaves, and the 2nd brigade immediately arrives. Therefore, this whole rotation became permanent. We proposed to agree on what the term significant fighting force means. We gave them specific proposals with figures on heavy weapons, small arms, and the number of military personnel who would fall under this definition. They categorically refused to discuss this. And as we showed goodwill over and over again, we proposed to lay strong foundations for our interaction with NATO. They did not agree to anything that would in any way limit their freedom of action, including to the detriment of our interests. As we did this, in general, we began to understand not only the futility of further relations with these states and their leaders, but also the need to send our signal as clearly as possible. This is what President Putin did at the Munich conference in 2007, when he openly and naturally politely drew the attention of the Western leaders present there to the fact that they will not be able to dictate their will to everyone, and that the world is much more diverse than Western civilization. Moreover, Western civilization has begun to degrade greatly in the context of the ideas that it is now promoting. In Europe, in the United States, and in other countries of the collective West, this warning made by Putin at the Munich conference was, by and large, not taken seriously either. They smiled. They decided that Russia was expressing its dissatisfaction in this way. And our further contacts with Western colleagues, during which we clearly and specifically explained to them the harmfulness of the course that the West has taken, believing that Russia can now be ignored. All these explanations of ours also went into the sand. But I note that we still did not lose the desire to overcome this confrontation, which was accumulating and which became more and more threatening. In 2008, we proposed concluding a European security treaty. Its essence was simple. Several years earlier, within the framework of the US, all countries of this organization at the highest level at the summit signed up to the principle of indivisible security. It said that not a single country, not a single organization in the US space would strengthen its security at the expense of the security of other countries, and not a single organization in the US space would claim to dominate this geopolitical territory. NATO did exactly the opposite. They continued to add new members, turning their greedy gaze to the countries of the former Soviet Union, in addition to the Baltic states, which ended up in the alliance even earlier. And we ask NATO that there is a political obligation not to dominate, and they are trying to dominate and strengthen their security to the detriment of us. How are they going to fulfill this commitment? But they answered us, you know, this is a political declaration signed by presidents and prime ministers, which does not carry any legal consequences.
So what we've just witnessed there was the Russian Foreign Prime Minister, Sergei Lavrov, who was speaking about the things that he was speaking about was on the Tucker Carlson Jeffrey Sachs show, which I'm putting it right here. You need to see that. I suggest you do. It makes all of this make too much sense, and stay blessed. Thanks a lot for watching. Please like, subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.